Amen. Hello, kindred. I am so glad to see all of you. I haven't been up here for about 3 weeks. We had, actually, I will say this way. My team is the best. And so I've been here. I try not to miss a week unless I'm out of town or something. So I've been here with them. But the last 3 weeks, we had Lindsay teach a couple times, and then our man Tommy taught last week. If you missed that, it was so great, and I would love for you guys to be able to catch up on this Genesis series on our podcast or on YouTube or whatever method. We've been finding that most people prefer to listen to me and watch them. So I don't know what that's about, but yeah, I don't know. But I'm so glad you're here. We've been in Genesis for now for 13 weeks, and so this is week 13. We have a few left. Like Tommy was making fun of me last week because I was talking about wanting to skip certain sections of Genesis. I'm just going to be upfront with you guys tonight. This is the one. So this is the one that I've been talking about the whole time. And I'm actually thankful for it as time goes on because there's so much richness in this passage tonight. We're going to go through 2 chapters tonight and then next week a few more. So last week, if you missed it, Tommy talked through the beginning of one of the most famous Genesis stories. It's the story of Joseph, a story that a lot of us know, at least in part. If not in whole. It's the story of this confident and some would say maybe arrogant kid. He was 17 or so at the time that had these dreams, these really vivid dreams that he started telling his family about. He started saying, I see you bowing down to me. I see me being, greater than you and all this kind of stuff that people just really love to hear from their little brother, right? Stuff like that. And then it all kind of comes to this point where his dad gives him this special jacket made of many colors that really is showing that he's his favorite son. So Joseph is the favored child. And the result is this. His brothers are so enraged that they decide to kill him. But instead, they fake his death and they sell him into slavery. Right? So if you weren't here last week, that's kind of where we left off. And I'm going to pick up right from there tonight. So this coat has been interesting to me every time I've heard this story. I always think about like whether it's the play on Broadway or even with the idea of what this coat might look like or what it is. It's always been really interesting to me. And really, as I started noticing, reading through Joseph's story, clothing pops up over and over again. So tonight, I'm going to ask you to notice how many times we see clothing or even like different things people wear, jewelry and things like that, play into these stories. It's a bunch of times. I also think that clothing is interesting in the way that we use it today, right? We use clothing to tell people kind of what we want them to know about us. Kind of, I think whether we know that we're doing that or not. To give you guys an idea of how boring my own inner dialogue can be at sometimes, earlier this week, I had this idea pop into my head as thought. I was like, I wonder when people started putting like advertisements on their clothing. Like when did it go from like plain colors to like we have Kindred shirts, or I wear my favorite band's shirt, or like I have a really cool Seinfeld t-shirt that I got at Target, right? It was a really cool thing. And I started wondering like, when does people start saying people will notice what's here, and they might check it out as well. But I really do think we do that with things that are important to us, whether it's those bands or those shows or whatever that might be. Like I wear Adidas and not really that much Nike because I just like it. These are from Costco. If you guys want to copy me, I think they were $30. They were wonderful shoes, yeah. We every single day make these decisions about what we want people to see about us, right? I wear black almost all the time, and I've been in therapy for that, and I'm going to figure out why at some point. At one point in my life, I dressed like this, which is horrifying, but it's great hair. And those glasses are back in style. It's really cool, right? No? Okay. And my dad's from Pittsburgh, if you're wondering why I'm wearing all Steelers stuff. He abused me as a child with that. And I wanted to portray a certain image with the way that I looked. That's a horrifying period of my life right there. So you can take that down. But every single day, we are making these decisions about what we want people to see and know about us. So Joseph, in this jacket, wearing this symbol of his father's love, it spoke volumes about himself and about Jacob too, and what Jacob was about and what Jacob wanted his sons to know too. So importantly for tonight, I want to start here. Joseph's brother Judah was the one in the story that came up with this idea that instead of killing him, we should sell him. We should sell him into slavery and get rid of him, but let's not kill him. But I want to make sure that we don't make any mistakes about where this story sits. I don't think they really cared what happened to Joseph. I think anything could have happened. He could have died from that point forward. They just didn't want to be guilty of actually killing him. And I've heard this story taught and used as this metaphor so many times for people that felt like they got mistreated. But I want to say tonight, this story is so much more than somebody being simply mistreated. This is a story where we're witnessing the destruction of sacred life that God created. It's a story that sees us witnessing the disorder of a family, this dysfunction, the loss of civility, a family being torn apart. It's a story that is of sons who deliberately break their father's heart, right? It's a story of slavery as a system that continues to degrade and harm people today as it did then. It's a story of evil. It's not just some situation where we pity poor Joseph. It's a story where we talk about evil destroying lives. I say that all the way around, this narrative, the story of Joseph, is a really rough story. I don't know for you guys, some of these more known stories, I don't know how you keep them in your head. I tend to, over the years, as I don't read them regularly, I tend to remember this thing happened, and this thing happened, and the story ultimately ends here, and maybe here's what I kind of carry from it. But as I've been reminded throughout these 13 weeks, over and over again as I read these stories, there is so much going on, so much detail that matters, even in a chapter like 38 that we're about to tackle. And tonight, it has so much stuff that I'm excited for us to learn together. So before I dive in, though, I want to make something really clear, and in fact, it's really that tonight is rated M for mature, okay? So I think that's like a video game system. I don't play them, but tonight's content is really pretty kind of racy, right? And so if you have somebody with you that you're like, I'd rather not have them hear some of the stuff that I'm about to say, I got to tell you, there's at least one sentence that's straight from Scripture that I'm going to say tonight on a microphone, right? That Tommy will have on recording for all of eternity, that I can't believe I'm going to say. But I'm going to say it because it's here in the Bible, and I believe that there's something for us to learn from it. But here we are, rated M for mature, Joseph, his brothers, Genesis 38. So Joseph's brothers have sold him into slavery, we know that, and he is on his way to his new setting. But before that, he is bought by a group of bandits that we see called the Midianites, who are actually the tribe of Ishmael. So if you've been here for the last month or so, you might remember that Ishmael is the name of Abraham's first son. The son that he had through deception, the son that he had through panic, the son that he had through a plan that was different than the one that God had, that he ultimately casts off. And so Ishmael's actually descendants are the ones who come and buy Joseph. And it's kind of this almost sort of revenge tale of this beloved younger child being taken away potentially to his demise by Ishmael's tribe. And the longer we've been in Genesis, the more that I've realized that over and over again, Genesis is a chronicle of deception after deception. It's really a list, like a running list of ways to ruin your life, right? It starts with the deception that Eve receives from Satan in the garden. The deception that Adam and Eve try to hide from God after committing that sin. It's the deception of Cain hiding from God after he killed his brother. It's the deception of Abraham and Sarah deceiving Pharaoh. It's Jacob and Rebekah deceiving Isaac. We have people like Laban and Leah and Rachel and Simon, and they all have their turns deceiving people throughout Genesis. So tonight, we have Joseph's brothers last week, and tonight we're going to add to the list the names Judah and Onan and Tamar and Potiphar's wife, who doesn't get to have a name, but we know her that way. These deceptions are important. They play a role in this narrative of the Bible that is really, really important, because what we're seeing is that from the very beginning of time, that people have continued to fall short of these things that God has in store for them, the things that he has in mind for them, whether they're big things and they're outwardly struggling with them, or whether they're things that they're hiding and carrying with them. And we see again and again that there's nobody in this passage, there's nobody in the Bible who's perfect until we get to Jesus. There's nobody who has it all figured out, even somebody like Joseph who's pretty good. I want you to hear this tonight. Every single one of us, we come in here tonight and we carry things too. And whether they're past things that we think we've dealt with, but they come back up, or they're present things that we know people will judge us for and we're afraid of, we come in here with those things. I want you to hear this. Those things that you carry, whether they're past, present, or maybe you even know it's going to happen soon, those aren't things that disqualify you from being around this church and these people, and they don't disqualify you from going to Jesus. They're not abnormal, and they're not strange, and even if a person or a church has made you feel like you can't be a part of them because of them, I want you to hear tonight that's not true here. When we allow our mistakes or our sin to keep us from this real freedom that we find in Jesus, we're deceiving ourselves. And when we allow other people to gaslight us, make us feel like they have it all together and we don't, again, we're allowing deceit to take over. And that's not going to happen here. And so for those reasons, I want to talk about this tonight. Joseph becomes this kind of central and interesting person to study on this kind of trip through Genesis that we're taking. Because like I said, he's a good man. He's not perfect, but he, relatively speaking, is a guy who's got most of his stuff together. And so it's still hard because we see him flawed. We find him in very difficult places. His good heart doesn't exempt him from really tough circumstances that we see come into his life. So we pick up the action in Genesis 38. Joseph's freshly off this caravan. He's in his new life in Egypt. We're going to get to him in chapter 39 here in just a moment. But the action in this chapter, it follows his brother Judah. Judah, who was the one who was convincing his brothers, let's just sell him, not kill him. We get to see Judah's life unfold. So he literally gets busy really quickly. This is 38:1. It says, at that time, Judah left his brothers, and he went down to stay with a man of Adullam named Hirah, which is kind of cool name, Hirah. So Judah, most likely, he fled from his father's home. We're thinking probably due to the grief caused by this mistake, this choice that he and his brothers made. And so he goes down to see who we think is probably one of his friends, and he goes to the land of the Canaanites in Canaan. The same place that Abraham went, the same place that if you were here for this part of the study, that Abraham was kind of exposed to some strange customs, child sacrifice, things like that. The people are living a very different way than God's chosen people, and this is where Judah chooses to make his home. And like a lot of people do when they move and go to a new place, he puts down roots pretty quickly. And the way that this story unfolds is very quickly. So 38 chapter 2 says this, Judah met the daughter of a Canaanite man named Shua. He married her, he made love to her, she became pregnant, and gave birth to a son who is named which is a noise, not a name. So they also then had sons named Onan, and I think it's pronounced Shelah. Let's say Shelah because it's funnier. So the writer skipped all of the love story. We don't get any background on who these people were, what maybe made decide to marry. We don't get any of this. It just tells us the straight stuff of what happened. And then again, we skip quickly. Er's entire childhood is over 2 verses later, and we're told this. Judah got a wife for his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. So a lot of us have heard this name Tamar. Tamar is about to become a central and major character in this narrative, and it really kind of in the biblical narrative. And as it comes in chapter 38 here, that many people breeze right over this story. And maybe it's because this story in chapter 38 is kind of an interruption in the middle of Joseph's bigger story, this chapter that kind of seems strange and misplaced. Or maybe it's because I think Tamar herself is sort of an interruption. And she's not easy to classify. She's not easy to figure out. And most of the time, I've heard Tamar taught as this kind of one-dimensional view of who she is and what she's up to. And I want to kind of try to change that tonight for those of you who know her story. So the son, is called wicked. And we see something happen here in Genesis that only happens twice, and it's both in this chapter. He's called wicked, and he's struck down by God, and is dead. He's gone. It's a unique way. It's a quick mention. They don't really say what it was about, but we know that is now no longer. And then we get this verse that is strange. It says this, Then Judah said to Onan, who's the middle brother, sleep with your brother's wife and fulfill your duty to her as a brother-in-law to raise up offspring for your brother. So your brother, who you remember is dead, we get this very strange verse. Now, I've had people all my life tell me, hey, I bought a Bible and I started reading it and I'm in Genesis, and then their eyes like almost burst out of their skull, right? And this is one of those verses. What in the world is going on with that verse? If we're reading without looking into it, without studying it, it's a strange scene, right? We stumbled across this really weird thing, but instead, what we're actually looking at is a very important Jewish custom. It's important because it's really aided the development and survival of the Jewish people all the way across the Old Testament. It's a thing called Levite Marriage, which lever means husband's brother in Latin. And even though it's a strange thing to us, it's really straightforward. This is what it is. When a man died, his next brother would take the widow in as his wife. And the heirs that came as a result were credited to the dead brother, meaning that all the inheritance would return to that family line. It also meant this. It meant that the widow was still part of that family, that she was taken care of, that she was safe. It's outlined in both Leviticus and Deuteronomy, and they're both chapter 25, so if you want to look those up later, which It's not like super stimulating reading, but Leviticus and Deuteronomy 25 outline exactly what this practice is. And it's also meant this, and in this case, it looked like this. That new heir is equal to the other brothers, his uncles, right? He's in line to receive the same inheritance that Judah would give to the other two boys one day, which maybe explains the behavior of Onan when he's called upon to fulfill this duty. Maybe it is that he doesn't want to split this money with somebody, and that's more important to him. And if you were here last week, I mentioned that we teach our kids in kids ministry a similar lesson to what we're learning in this room. This is not in their lesson tonight, rest assured, okay? This is Genesis 38, verse 9. But Onan knew that the child would not be his, so whenever he slept with his brother's wife, he spilled his semen on the ground to keep from providing offspring for his brother. Yeah, that's in the Bible right there. So his refusal to play this role actually leads to him being the second one to be struck down by God in Genesis, in this really unusual way for somebody to die. He's using a very deceptive practice. And I've heard this taught in different ways, but when you look at Hebrew and dissect it and try to figure out what's going on in here, that's all that's going on. He doesn't want to get his wife pregnant, probably his brother's wife pregnant, because he doesn't want to split his inheritance with this kid. So Judah's first two sons, we find out really quickly, and Onan, who are both struck dead by their weak character, are pretty bad people, right? And it seems by what happens next that Judah's character is really weak as well. His third son from Tamar would still have this law applied to him. So this kid that I'm calling Sheila would have the same duty and the same obligation. But it tells us this. It tells us that Judah was scared to lose all three of his kids, which makes sense. I think any parent in here would say, yeah, I would be the same way. I'd be in the same spot that Judah was. So this is what happens. Instead of doing the right thing, Judah says to her, go live as a widow in your father's household until he grows up. At some point, he'll grow up, and then I'll let you, marry him, and I'll let you back into our family. I'll let you have all the things that you deserve by this law and by our way of life. So Tamar is essentially cheated out of her right to have an heir, as her right to remain a part of this household. It's her right to be part of the entire family and everything that they have. She's sent back to live at home, really with no prospect to break free of this new life that she would find herself in. And in case it needs to be told to anyone that maybe would be wondering, the life of a widow at this time would not have been a good life. It would have been a very, very difficult life, and probably one of the harder lives that you could imagine. She'd have no way to work. She'd have no real prospects to make life okay for her. So Judah, who sold his brother, raised at least two pretty horrible kids, horrible enough to be struck down dead by the Lord. And now he adds this to his resume, cheating a widow out of her rights, right? Pretty soon after this, possibly ironically, Judah himself becomes a widower. His wife passes away. He enlists his same pal, Hurrah, for one last journey together. It's the last hurrah. I can do the jokes that Tommy does too. So he takes a journey with him, maybe as a chance to kind of clear his mind, start his life over, figure out where he is. And then we get to see really what kind of person Judah is. We get this further glimpse into his character and maybe into the way that the Canaanite culture has corrupted the way that he was raised. Here's what happens. Tamar finds out that he's passing by. She's desperate. And we're told this. She took off her widow's clothes. Here's clothes showing up again. She covered herself with a veil to disguise herself. And then she waited for Judah and his traveling party to pass by. She was on to his plan, and we're told this. She saw that, although Sheila had grown up, she had not been given to him as his wife. So, notice how clothing makes another appearance here, right? We have Joseph's coat that was a key to his demise. And before that, we had the soup stealing thing that Lindsay taught about 3 weeks ago when she insisted that soup is a meal and she's wrong, where they essentially used a fur coat to deceive Isaac and steal a birthright for the younger son. Now we see here Tamar is first changing out of her mourning clothing, something that signifies her station in life and who she is, and then employing this disguise to make herself unknown to Judah, right? And we're about to find out why. Much more than that whole thing, what's going on here. See, the deceptions that take place throughout Genesis often involve clothing in some manner. From Adam and Eve realizing they had no clothing, all the way to where we find ourselves here in chapter 38. Here's Judah's character shining through in verse 15. It says, when Judah saw her, he thought she was a prostitute, for she had covered her face. Not realizing that she was his daughter-in-law, he went over to her by the roadside and said, come now, let me sleep with you. All class all the time, this guy, right? He's living the life. I guess the saving grace here is supposed to be that he didn't realize that it was his daughter-in-law. But how rough is that, right? That's a rough passage. Tamar, however, she's been portrayed in a lot of different ways that I've heard and read. Whatever we think of what she's up to here, I want to say this, she's smart, right? We know that she's both smart and she's desperate. And she's looking for a way out of what's become really the theft of her position in this family and in the society, right? So here's what she does. She negotiates this price to sleep with Judah. The price is a goat that he doesn't have with him, which is a really weird price. But then she says, until you can bring me that payment, I'm going to ask you for your seal, something called your cord, and your staff until you pay up. And these are personal effects. These are things that Judah would carry with him that told everybody what he wanted them to think of him, who he was. It's basically more clothing. I read that it'd be basically like us saying right now, until you pay me, let me hold your driver's license and your passport. It's something really personal that could only be his. So again, we see clothing playing a huge role in this narrative. It tells us this. He gave them to her, and he slept with her, and she became pregnant by him. After she left, she took off her veil, and she put on her widow's clothes again, back into the station that she found herself in life. The deception here is complete, and we have to assume as she returns to her life as a widow, she doesn't know that she's pregnant for a little while, right? What we are sure of is this, is that she is determined to turn this into a positive for herself. As strange as the circumstances might be and as easy as they might be for us to judge, right? When Judah later sends Hurrah in with this promised goat, they find out that there's no prostitutes in the area. Nobody can understand who they're looking for or what they mean. And they find out that no one has seen her and that she probably doesn't exist. Judah is afraid to be embarrassed. Judah's afraid to be caught. Judah shows us some signs that he knows that his character is corrupted. And so he tells his friend, go ahead and just leave it there. I don't want anybody to know what happened. As the story unfolds, a few months later, some men come to Judah and they tell him, hey, your daughter-in-law Tamar has been found guilty of prostitution and she's pregnant. His response shows us, maybe clearer than anything else, what his real character is. Although he's obviously guilty of the exact same crime, he says this, bring her out and have her burned to death. It's immediate reaction. Now, Tamar pulls off this move here that I think is kind of straight out of like a really cool movie or a novel or something, and it says this, as she was being brought out, she sent a message to Judah. I'm pregnant by the man who owns these. See if you recognize whose seal and cord and staff these are. She throws his passport and his ID at him. Judah finds himself in one of those spots, right? You know those spots. Maybe, hopefully, it's not something as crazy as this, but you know that moment where you're busted, right? Where the story's collapsed and there's no amount of talking your way out of it. There's no other option but to figure out the best way to come clean. Honestly, part of me kind of expects him at this moment for Judah to try to talk his way out of it, to try to make another lie, another deception, but he knows that he's met his reckoning. And so he says this. He says, she is more righteous than I, since I wouldn't give her my son. And then it tells us this, he did not sleep with her again. What a guy, right? I know that last detail is in there to tell us this, that he changed his ways, but I'm really like, if I could talk to Judah right now, I'd be like, buddy, you didn't have a chance. Come on, right? That's a weird detail. Tamar ends up giving birth to Judah's twin boys. And so as the action kind of winds down in chapter 38, we see again the younger one steals the birth order in this passage that's maybe medically iffy, but again, it involves a kind of a red thread that they tie around the baby's wrist. So again, clothing in some regard is brought here. And once again, a youngest child steals a birthright and a birth order and becomes the favored child in this moment. And two important things wrap up this little part of the story. First one is this. Tamar, and all of her implied and maybe obvious faults, is more of a moral character than Judah in this story. And more than that, we find out later that Tamar is actually an ancestor of Jesus, that this line that has been produced through this story and through this deception produces Jesus. The younger brother that steals the birth order here is named Perez, and he's from the line of King David. King David is one of his eventual descendants, and Jesus is one of King David's. And the second one is this. Judah is really being revealed here as a perfect character foil for Joseph. Joseph, who's kind of the hero of this part of Genesis, has this brother who's kind of the opposite of him. So as chapter 39 starts, we see Joseph and exactly how he's different than his brother. Because chapter 39 is another famous story of seduction. It's right on the back of Judah and Tamar's affair, and Joseph, enslaved in the home of this captain of Pharaoh's guard in Egypt, a man named Potiphar, and his wife, who doesn't have a name, like I said earlier. And right away we're told this: the Lord was with Joseph so that he prospered, so that he succeeded. And this is really a running theme for Joseph's life. He would have bought the plaque at Hobby Lobby with the verse on it, right, if that existed, and put it on his wall, because this directed everything in his life. He finds favor in Potiphar's eyes, probably because he's smart and probably because he showed him how to run his house really well. And it says that Joseph was responsible for everything in Potiphar's house except for his diet. And I read about that this week. I'll save you some time. The Egyptians ate some weird stuff, okay? So Joseph is that trusted. The trouble comes here is that we're told that Joseph is well-built and handsome. And the Hebrew is literally saying he's well-built and nice to look at, right? And I will say this. I noticed last week when Tommy was talking, these front rows were full. So nobody's ever said this about me. But he was well-built and he was nice to look at. And the wife of Potiphar goes full soap opera. And she comes to him and says, "Come to my bed." Right? So, again, this character foil is in play. So Judah, who we just got done watching the story for, I think he would have been there in moments, right? He would have been so excited for this jailer's wife to be his. But Joseph tells her this. He says, "How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" Right? Joseph's character is much different. We're told that she persists, and it uses a kind of a Jewish euphemism for a long, long time. So it tells us that day after day after day she persists until she's finally had enough and she comes up with a plan. So here's how that goes. It says, one day Joseph went into the house to attend to his duties, and none of the other household servants was inside. She caught him by his cloak and said, "Come to bed with me." But he left his cloak in her hand and ran out of the house. So there's clothing again. From there, she uses this cloak, again, this garment, to tell her story to anyone that will listen, that she says, "Joseph tried to assault me." She tells it 4 different times in the passage that we have, and she changes little things each time. I think all of us know from experience that when we start hearing a story and it develops and it changes, that we start to question how good that account really is. Her account's on pretty shaky ground. But she has this cloak. She has this garment from Joseph that is proof that he had disrobed in her house. And again, Joseph finds himself descending in status with his clothing providing this evidence of a crime that he didn't actually commit. Potiphar puts him in prison, and every source that I can read said it's a miracle he didn't kill him. And interestingly here, this word for prison in this passage is the same word that was used last week for this well or this cistern that he was thrown into by his brothers. He's back in this low place. He's been punished for something that he didn't do, while his character foil, Judah, along with all these other brothers, they walk free from all their crimes and just live their life every single day. And chapter 39 ends with this parallel idea. It says this: Joseph's in prison, but it says, while Joseph was there in prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. The Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. So, as much as Genesis continues to be this study of deception, this study of sinful patterns, we see tonight it also has a study in character. What truly sets apart those that seek after God with all that they have, despite good or bad circumstances, and those that look out for themselves to other people's peril. So I want to say this: character is taught in a lot of different ways. But I want to say, biblically speaking, it's not about who you are. It's not about your gender or your age or your occupation, your education, your level of understanding of the Bible itself. It's not about some kind of formula to get better, some kind of formula to obtain more, to be more like somebody else. It's not about your politics or your pet issues, or it's not about being right. Character in the Bible is about one thing only. It's about being Christ-like. You can be all those other things. You can be better than 99% of the world, but if you aren't reflecting Jesus, right? If you're not loving more than lecturing, if you're not caring more about the hearts of others than about being right, if you're not losing so that Jesus is winning, the Apostle Paul tells us that we are, quote, a resounding gong or clanging cymbal, or in other words, just annoying noise. A Christ-like character is not found in gender or age or any of those other things. Instead, it's found this way. Paul tells us, set your minds on things above, not on earthly things. And he says, now you must rid yourselves of all things such as these: anger, rage, malice, slander, and filthy language from your lips. He says, do not lie to each other, since you've taken off your old self with its practices and have put on the new self, which is being renewed in knowledge in the image of its creator. Here, there is no Jew or Gentile. There's no circumcised, which is really saying there's no people who are part of the club, or uncircumcised people who are outsiders. He said there's no slave or free, but Christ is all, and Christ is in all. And if that's not enough of a metaphor, listen to what he does next. He says, therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. Bear with one another and forgive one another if any of you has a grievance against someone. Forgive as the Lord forgave you. And over all these virtues put on love, which binds them all together in perfect unity. It goes on, and it's a very beautiful passage from there, but I want you to notice a few things here. First is this. Paul is calling us to aspirational character. He isn't saying that faith or even heaven itself is for those that have all this together, right? He's not saying that at all. This week, I personally, I'm sure you did too, experienced some anger, maybe some malice. I'm sure I probably slandered people. I'm sure I said things that I regret. And yet, I'm not afraid that I lost my salvation, right? Or that I somehow am less of a good person, because I'm aware of this. Jesus alone gives me any claim to goodness. On my own, I can't do it. So it's not that we have achieved all of those things. It's not that we're living this stuff perfectly, but it's rather that we're pushing towards it. That is our goal, right? Character comes in that hard work of pushing towards who we want to be. And in fact, in this verse, we can see this truth set out. Paul says, get rid of these things, which really is this. It's implying that they're still a part of these people, these Colossians' lives. And then he says, you're God's chosen people anyways. Kind of implied there. And importantly, in all the places we saw tonight, that clothing marks this Joseph narrative, right? His robe from his father, the clothing that Tamar employs to fool Judah, Judah's personal effects, Potiphar's wife tearing his clothing and keeping that cloak. We see more examples next week. Paul's instruction to those who are seeking Christ-like character is to wear compassion and kindness and humility and gentleness and patience. If those things sound familiar, it's a grouping of some of what is called the fruit of the Spirit, which is things that we display when the Holy Spirit is in control of our lives. Our invitation in Colossians is to try them on, to see if they can become part of our daily routine, to see if the Holy Spirit's direction can become second nature, to see if that can be the thing that we wear that we want other people to see and other people to notice and other people to want. And in that, we become the kind of people that can move through any circumstances like Joseph did. The kind of people that can know that because we belong to God, that we be confident that like Joseph, he's with us, that he shows us favor, that he makes paths for us even in the darkest places and darkest moments of our lives, that he spurs us on to greater things, that as we're living as his people for the benefit and the good of those around us, in spite of any challenges we might face, any decisions that we might make or are made for us, that we can continue to push towards Christ-like character. Kindred, would you stand up with me as I pray for us? God, I'm so thankful for this church and for the people in this room with me tonight. God, I pray as we look at some of these stories from Genesis, we see stories of people with really terrible character. We see stories of people with a little bit better character, maybe people with pretty good character. God, I thank you that we have Jesus. Jesus who calls us into this life where we're allowed to try on these things, to wear the fruit of the Spirit, to show people that we don't have it all figured out, but we're becoming something better than what we started the day with. And so, God, I pray tonight as we leave here that through Jesus, each one of us could have a little bit more compassion, a little bit more kindness, a little bit more patience, a little bit more humility. God, that we could be the kind of people who chase after you and bring the people that we love, the people that we just met, and even the people that we struggle with along to something better than they could have had. Not because we're good, but because Jesus is. Thank you, and I pray this in his name. Amen.